So, what if I told you that the local news stations in your area, the ones that are supposed to compete, chase different stories, hold each other accountable, might actually be answering to the same company? Not someday, not hypothetically, right now. And not just in one city, but across the country. Because while we've all been busy arguing about whether media is too liberal or too conservative or too biased, something else has been happening. Quietly, in the background, fewer companies owning more of what you see. And today I want to talk about something we really don't talk about nearly enough. Not media bias, not fake news. Something more basic than that. Who actually owns the news that you're watching? Hello all. You're listening to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. Podcast about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host. And today we're going to be talking about local TV stations. You probably don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about who owns your local stations, but there is a reason why you might want to. In fact, as days go by, it's becoming more and more of an issue. We spend a lot of time in this country arguing about the media. A lot of folks say it's too left. Some folks complain about the pieces of it that are too far right, too dramatic, too obsessed with ratings. And listen, a lot of that criticism is fair, depending on your perspective. Cable news especially can feel like a bunch of people yelling at each other for a living. But underneath all of that, there is a more important question. Before bias, before spin, before the talking points of the people sitting in front of the cameras, the question to ask is how many different people are actually making the decisions about the station in the first place. Because if that number is smaller than we think, everything else starts to look a little different in that light. So when people think about the media, they usually are thinking about things like CNN and Fox News and MS Now and, those types of outlets. The loud stuff, the viral clips, the 24 hours a day, the arguments. But that's not how a lot of people experience the news every day. Most people interact with local news. The station that tells you if, school is closed, if there's a storm coming, if there's a road shut down, what's happening in your area. Most people have their favorite. It's familiar, it's routine, it's a daily part of life. I can remember watching the news every day at 6 o'clock with my parents, same station, every evening. It's part of daily life, and here's the key. People tend to trust local news more than national news. It feels closer, it's a lot less performative, usually, seems more real, and when trust is high, influence is high. And that matters. It matters a lot. So let's talk about the company at the center of this episode, Nexstar. Now, if you've never heard of them, don't worry. That's kind of the point. They're not a household name by any stretch, but they are the largest owner of local TV stations in the United States. And they're getting bigger by buying more stations, expanding their footprint, reaching more households. At this point, you're talking about a company that reaches a huge portion of the country. Not a niche audience, not a small region, a massive slice of American households. Officially, Nexstar is limited to about 39% of U.S. households. But when you factor in its full footprint, owned stations, affiliate stations, network reach, its content actually can reach close to 80% of the country, which tells you something about how meaningful that limit really is. And under normal circumstances, there are supposed to be limits on that. There's a rule, at least on paper, that no single broadcast company should reach more than 39% of U.S. households. That's the cap. The idea is simple. Don't let one company control too much of what people see and hear. Now, that seems reasonable. Just a basic guardrail. But then we got creative. There's something called the UHF discount. Now, for most people, at least people in my age bracket, UHF was that second dial on your TV that you usually never had to touch for any reason. But as far as the UHF discount is concerned, this is the short version. Some stations are counted as reaching fewer viewers than they actually do. So on paper, everything looks fine. They're under the limit. No problem. But in reality, they can go well beyond the 39%. It's kind of like having a speed limit and then deciding that certain miles don't count towards your speed. And I know that seems odd, but stick with me. How about getting pulled over and saying, yeah, but half of those miles shouldn't count? Technically, you're following the rule, I guess. Functionally, you're not even close. And here's where this starts to matter. Because this isn't about breaking the rules. It's about bending them until they barely mean anything. Now, let's bring this down from the national level to something that closer to home example, at least closer to home for me, but I think by narrowing it down, it'll be more relatable for anyone. In places like central to western Pennsylvania, you've got stations like ABC 27 and Fox 43. Different branding, different anchors, different logos, and they're supposed to be competing. They're supposed to be pushing each other, but under this kind of consolidation, you can end up with something very different. Different logos, same boss. And in some places, that's already the reality. It's not hypothetical. It's not theoretical. It's already happening. And when that happens, you don't necessarily get less news, but you get less competition, less urgency, less incentive to go deeper than the other station, because there really is no other station. Not really, not from your owner's perspective. Now, let me be clear on something, because this is where, people might tend to jump. This is not about your local news suddenly turning into propaganda. You're not going to turn on your 6 p.m. broadcast and see cable-style shouting matches. That's really not how this works. this is quieter than that, subtler. It shows up in choices. It shows up in what gets covered. Stations chose what gets not to air. Emphasized. Jimmy Kimmel Live after what he made 2 minutes remarks and what about gets 20 seconds figure. Now, because bias doesn't always show up in what's said. So sometimes it shows up in what never gets said at all. Again, to be clear, there was a moment choice not gives a little insight into how these decisions play out. Is not proof of some grand political agenda. It's not a smoking gun necessarily, but it is a decision, and it tells you something, because when a call had to be made, that's the direction it went. And when one company is making those decisions across a large part of the country, well, now it starts to matter more. And if you're thinking, okay, this is just about local news, zoom out for a moment, because this isn't just happening locally. Across the entire media landscape, you're seeing more and more consolidation. Big companies merging, studios getting bought, streaming platforms combining, massive libraries of content ending up under fewer corporate umbrellas. You've got details involving companies like Paramount and Skydance. That's been in the news a lot lately. You've got Warner Brothers Discovery restructuring after a major consolidation. Different companies, different deals, same direction. And now Paramount Skydance is set to buy Warner Brothers Discovery, essentially bringing all four of those major media companies under one umbrella. Fewer independent players, more centralized control, more decisions being made by fewer people. And for my intents and purposes, it should be noted that this purchase is going to be made by, in large part, the Ellison family, a family that is known for its large contributions and connections to the Republican Party. So, when you line that up with what's happening in local news, now it starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like a trend. Now, none of this happens on its own. These deals require approval. Regulators have to sign off. That brings us to the FCC and Brendan Carr. Carr has supported loosening ownership rules, arguing that consolidation helps local stations survive. Of course, we're pretending for a moment that it's the FCC's job to make stations financially and fiscally viable, when it's really their job to monitor the content and deal with things like these giant mergers, not in how they affect dollars and cents for the companies, but in how they affect the public who relies on these companies. He says that they need scale to compete with big tech companies and streaming platforms. And the argument isn't crazy. Local news is struggling, ad revenue is down. The media landscape has changed drastically. But again, as I say, this is not really the FCC's job. And also, critics look at this and say, okay, but if the solution is fewer owners and less competition and more concentration, are we solving the problem, or are we just reshaping the problem? And given Carr's known alignment with Trump-era regulatory thinking, there are a lot of people, including myself, who look at these approvals and think, yeah, this is not exactly surprising. And again, You don't have to believe there's a conspiracy. You don't need to picture a smoke-filled room with, the big executives sitting around and making, these diabolical speeches. But you should ask a simple question. When one company gets this big and the rules meant to limit that get stretched, who benefits? That's the question in so many of these things, is who is benefiting? Now, why this should matter to you? This isn't abstract. This affects real things. What stories get covered? How local issues are framed? What gets attention and what doesn't get attention? It can affect local elections. It can affect public awareness. No matter how small your community is, what people in your community think matters. And the wild part, most people don't ever notice because everything sort of looks the same. When a local TV station is bought, the anchors don't usually change. The desk and the set doesn't change. The music stays the same. It all feels very normal, the same way it felt the day before. But behind the scenes, there are fewer voices and fewer decision makers, more centralized control. And we've been trained to argue about bias, left versus right, and fair versus unfair. But bias is only one part of the story. The other part of the story, the bigger issue, is concentration. Because even a slight lean becomes more powerful when fewer people control more of the system. And that's where we are. Not total control, not some, dystopian scenario, but a steady shift toward fewer independent voices. So maybe the next time we argue about media bias, before we jump into who's right and who's wrong, maybe we take a step back and ask a different question. Not simply, is this biased? But how many people are actually deciding what I'm seeing? Because if the answer is not that many, that might explain more than bias ever could. All right, everybody, thank you for taking the time to download and listen to this installment of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. As always, I would love to hear from you. Let me know if you were aware of this situation with your local news stations. Let me know if you're concerned about it. Anything, critiques, compliments, suggestions, whatever, I would love to hear from you. You can go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, and you can find a contact page with numerous ways to get in touch with me at the podcast. There is also a web player on that website where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And there's also a blog section of the podcast where you can read blog posts that mirror the subjects that I talk about in the various episodes. And those blog posts include all the sources that I use. We'll be back on Monday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So until then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.